At 25,000 feet over Berlin, the cockpit of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 is a freezing tomb of vibrating aluminum and plexiglass. The German pilot scans the horizon, his eyes burning from the glare of the high-altitude sun. He is deep within the Reich, supposedly safe from the short-legged fighters that guard the Allied bombers. But then he sees them, a glint of polished metal in the distance, swarming like angry hornets around the lumbering B-17s. It is a sight that drains the blood from his face, the P-51 Mustangs. He knows with a sinking dread that these silver ghosts have the fuel to chase him all the way to the Polish border. There is no escape, no sanctuary, only a relentless pursuit that turns the sky into a cage. He fears the Mustang because it denies him the safety of distance. But shift the scene to the low-level haze over the French coast, and the texture of fear changes instantly. Here, the German pilot does not scan the horizon, he frantically checks his tail. He is not afraid of being chased down over hours. He is terrified of being outmaneuvered in seconds. He spots the elliptical wings of a Spitfire rising from the cloud deck. His knuckles turn white on the stick. He knows that if he engages in a turning fight, the laws of aerodynamics are against him. The Spitfire is not a hunter of endurance. It is a knife fighter, agile, graceful, and deadly in a phone booth. He fears the Mustang for its reach, but he dreads the Spitfire for its bite. Today, we uncover the shocking truth about U.S. and British battlefield dominance. To comprehend the distinct terrors inflicted by these two machines, we must first understand the desperate fires in which they were forged. The Supermarine Spitfire and the North American P-51 Mustang were not merely aircraft, they were the aluminum embodiments of two radically different national strategies. The Spitfire was a child of the Battle of Britain, born from the existential threat of invasion. In 1940, the Royal Air Force did not need a fighter that could fly to Berlin and back. They needed a fighter that could scramble from a grass airfield in Kent, climb like a rocket to intercept German bombers over the Channel, and turn tightly enough to survive a dogfight with a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was a point defense interceptor, a defensive shield designed with short legs but razor-sharp reflexes. Its philosophy was dictated by geography. The war was happening directly overhead, and the Spitfire was the ultimate duelist for a battle fought within sight of one's own home. For the Luftwaffe pilots stationed across the Channel in occupied France, the Spitfire represented a permanent tactical wall. They knew that venturing into British airspace meant entering a zone where aerodynamics favored the enemy. The Spitfire's elliptical wing, a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, provided an immense amount of lift, allowing it to turn tighter than almost anything the Germans could field. To engage a Spitfire in a turning fight was to enter a slow-motion suicide pact. The German veterans learned quickly: dive, slash, and run. Do not get pulled into the horizontal dance. This respect for the Spitfire's agility was etched into the Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine early in the war. It was a known quantity, a fearsome guardian of its territory, but its threat was localized. As long as the Luftwaffe stayed deep inside Europe, the Spitfire was a distant memory, a monster locked in its cage. The American entry into the air war brought a philosophy that was diametrically opposed to this defensive stance. The United States Army Air Forces arrived in England with a doctrine of audacious offensive violence, daylight precision bombing. The plan was to bludgeon the German industrial base into submission by flying massive fleets of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into the heart of the Reich in broad daylight. American planners initially believed that the bombers, bristling with heavy machine guns, would be self-defending porcupines capable of fighting their way to the target. It was a calculation built on hubris and a misunderstanding of air combat physics. Throughout 1943, this doctrine was dismantled piece by piece in the freezing skies over Germany. The Luftwaffe fighters, stripping the bombers of their protection once the short-range Allied escorts turned back, slaughtered the American formations. This period, known to the crews as the Shivering Skies, created a false sense of security for the German pilots defending the Reich. They knew exactly where the leash ended. They watched on their radar screens as the P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires reached the limit of their fuel near the German border and turned for home. The moment the escorts turned back, the Luftwaffe pilots would extinguish their cigarettes, climb into their cockpits, and prepare for a turkey shoot. For the German pilots, the deep sky over Germany was a sanctuary where they could form up at leisure, pick their angles of attack, and dismantle the bomber streams without fear of fighter opposition. They feared the Spitfire over the Channel, yes, but over the Ruhr Valley they felt untouchable. They believed the laws of physics, the ratio of fuel weight to engine power, protected them as much as their flak batteries did. But in late 1943, that sanctuary evaporated. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang was not just the introduction of a new aircraft, it was a technological anomaly that broke the established rules of aviation. Originally designed for the British as a low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft, the Mustang was a good but unremarkable airframe. It was the decision to marry this aerodynamic American shell with the legendary British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that created a hybrid monster. Suddenly, the Allies possessed a fighter that retained the high-altitude performance of a dedicated interceptor, but carried enough fuel to fly from London to Berlin and back. The shock of this capability cannot be overstated. When Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring first saw American fighters over Berlin, he reportedly whispered to his staff that the war was lost. It was a psychological thunderclap. The P-51 did not just escort bombers, it hunted. It roamed hundreds of miles ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the airspace, attacking airfields, and disrupting the Luftwaffe's assembly areas. The German pilot, once safe deep within his own territory, suddenly found himself fighting for his life over his own base. The safety of distance had been annihilated. The P-51 brought the fight to the enemy's bedroom, forcing the Luftwaffe to battle not on their terms, but on the Americans' terms. The context of the air war had shifted from a tactical defense of borders to a strategic strangulation of the entire German airspace. It was Major General Jimmy Doolittle who finally unleashed the Mustang's full potential and sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. Upon taking command of the 8th Air Force in early 1944, he walked into the fighter headquarters and saw a sign that read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." He ordered it taken down. He replaced the doctrine of passive defense with one of aggressive, calculated destruction. His new standing order was simple, brutal, and transformative. Pursue and destroy the enemy air force wherever you find them. This directive unleashed the Mustangs from the bomber formations. They were no longer tethered sheepdogs, they were wolves. They began to roam far ahead of the B-17s, catching the German fighter formations as they were struggling to assemble, climbing sluggishly with heavy fuel loads, or even taxiing on their own runways. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight for its life before it could even see the bombers it was supposed to stop. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Spitfire had evolved into a completely different kind of predator. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, the Spitfire's role shifted from the desperate defense of Britain to the tactical domination of France. The later Marks, particularly the Mk IX and the Griffin-powered Mk XIV, were beasts optimized for the brutal, chaotic arena of low to medium altitude warfare. They were stripped of the need for extreme range, honed instead for sheer rate of climb and acceleration.
For the German pilot flying over Normandy, the Spitfire was the master of the vertical. It could pull lead in a turn that would stall a Focke-Wulf 190 into a spin. It could climb away from a bad engagement with a power-to-weight ratio that defied gravity. The Spitfire became the ruler of the phone booth war over the front lines, where reaction time was measured in milliseconds and the margin for error was zero. The Germans were now caught in a lethal pincer of aerial capability. At 30,000 feet, in the thin, cold air over the Reich, the P-51 ruled with speed, range, and laminar flow efficiency. It forced the Luftwaffe to modify their aircraft into heavy, armored interceptors, the Sturmbacke, laden with extra cannons and plating to survive the defensive fire of the B-17s. But these modifications made the German fighters sluggish and heavy. When these same heavy armored interceptors designed to kill bombers were clumsy prey for the nimble British fighters, the Luftwaffe could not build a single plane to defeat both threats. If they stripped armor to fight the Spitfire, the B-17 gunners and Mustangs would shred them. If they added armor to survive the bombers, the Spitfires would fly circles around them. This operational dilemma broke the back of the Jagdwaffe. Intelligence reports from the spring of 1944 reveal a collapse in morale, driven not just by losses, but the omnipresence of the threat. A popular, bitter joke circulating in the German mess halls captured the despair perfectly. If you see a silver plane, it's American. If you see a dark plane, it's British. If you see no plane, it's the Luftwaffe. The humor masked a terrifying reality. The enemy controlled the variables of the engagement. The Americans dictated where the battle would happen. The British dictated how the battle would be fought. The logistical strangulation was equally severe. The P-51s, with their loitering time, began to strafe the German training airfields and fuel depots deep in the interior. This denied the Luftwaffe the ability to train new pilots. The veterans were dying against the Spitfires over the Channel and the Mustangs over Berlin, and they were being replaced by boys with barely a dozen hours of flight time. These novices were thrown into cockpits of high-performance machines and told to face the two greatest fighter aircraft of the war. They entered a sky where the P-51 was waiting to kill them on the way to the battle, and the Spitfire was waiting to kill them if they arrived. As the invasion fleets gathered in the southern ports of England, the German Air Force was already a hollow shell, exhausted by the relentless pursuit of the Mustang and terrified of the sharp, turning blade of the Spitfire. The stage was set for the ultimate test of these fears in the skies over Fortress Europe.
To witness this ultimate test, we must step into the fur-lined boots of a Luftwaffe experte, an ace with 50 kills, strapped into his Focke-Wulf 190 at 28,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley. It is early 1944. For this pilot, fear is not a sudden spike of adrenaline, it is a chronic, freezing exhaustion. He has been climbing for 30 minutes, his engine screaming to lift the heavy armor plating he carries to survive the American bombers. The air outside is minus 50 degrees. His oxygen mask chafes his sweat-slicked skin. When the call comes over the radio, Indians at 12 o'clock, he looks up, praying to see the short-winged thunderbolts that will soon turn back. Instead, he sees the distinct, angular silhouettes of P-51 Mustangs, glinting silver in the sun, dropping their external fuel tanks. The tanks tumble away like discarded bomb casings, a visual signal that the Americans are now lightening their load to kill. The engagement that follows is defined by a terrifying sense of inevitability. The German pilot knows that the Mustang is aerodynamically superior in this thin air. Its laminar flow wing cuts through the atmosphere with a smoothness his radial-engined Focke-Wulf cannot match.
When he dives to escape, the Mustang dives with him, its airframe shivering but holding together as the airspeed indicator pushes past 450 miles per hour. There is no shaking it. The fear here is the fear of a marathon runner being chased by a sprinter who somehow has endless endurance. The American pilot does not seem to care about fuel. He chases the German across grid squares, across state lines, deep into territory that should be safe. The German pilot is fighting a machine that refuses to acknowledge the concept of home territory. This fear is compounded by the sheer industrial weight of the enemy. If the German manages to shoot down the Mustang, he knows that tomorrow 2 more will take its place. But if the German bails out, he is not returning to a surplus of aircraft. He is returning to a burning airfield. The P-51s do not just fight in the air, they follow the Germans down. As the Luftwaffe flight tries to land, low on fuel and ammunition, the Mustangs drop to tree-top height. They strafe the hangars, the control towers, and the taxiing aircraft. The German pilot realizes with horror that the safest place in the Reich is no longer his own runway. The Mustang has turned the entire country into a free fire zone. It is a psychological siege where the walls are made of sky and the enemy is everywhere, all the time. But transmit this pilot to the jagged coastline of Normandy in June 1944, and the texture of the nightmare shifts violently. He is now flying a Bf 109 G6, supporting the desperate retreat of the Wehrmacht. The sky here is thick with clouds, the ceiling low, the visibility poor. He is not looking for silver specks in the stratosphere. He is watching the gray gloom for a shadow that moves faster than his own. Suddenly, his wingman explodes. There was no tracer fire, just a sudden disintegration. He brakes hard to the left, pulling 5 Gs, his vision graying out as the blood drains from his head. In his rearview mirror, he sees the distinctive elliptical wings of a Spitfire Mk IX glued to his tail. The fear of the Spitfire is claustrophobic. It is the terror of being in a knife fight in a phone booth. The German pilot knows he cannot turn with this enemy. The Spitfire's wing loading is so low, its lift so tremendous, that it can pull a turn radius tighter than anything the Luftwaffe possesses. When the German tries to circle, the Spitfire will cut inside his arc and fill his cockpit with 20mm cannon shells. He feels a physical helplessness, a sensation that his controls are sluggish compared to the razor-sharp reflexes of the British machine. He jams the throttle forward, engaging the methanol water injection to boost his engine, trying to climb, to dive, to do anything to break the geometry of death. But the Spitfire hangs there, defying gravity, its Merlin engine screaming a high-pitched note that cuts through the roar of battle. This is not the exhausted resignation of fighting the Mustangs. This is panic. It is a visceral, immediate reaction to a predator that is physically superior in the dance of combat. The German pilot knows that the American Mustang is a strategic weapon, a long-range executioner that kills you with logistics and speed. But the British Spitfire is a tactical assassin. It does not need to fly to Berlin to kill you. It only needs to find you once in the clouds over France, and it will outfly you until you are dead. The Mustang kills the German Air Force. The Spitfire kills the German pilot. In the debriefing rooms back at the scattered, camouflaged airfields, the difference in trauma is palpable. Pilots returning from the high-altitude battles against the Americans sit in silence, staring at the floor, crushed by the weight of numbers and the relentlessness of the pursuit. They speak of the Indianer, Indians who never stop coming. But the pilots returning from the low-level scraps with the British are shaking, their adrenaline still spiking. They speak of the Spit, describing its movements with a mixture of awe and hatred. One captures the essence of the dual threat. With the Americans, you are never safe. With the British, you are never good enough.
This duality of fear extends beyond the cockpit and into the very geography of the battlefield. For the German ground crews and flak gunners, the presence of the Americans is announced by a dull, vibrating roar that shakes the earth long before the planes are visible. It is the sound of industrial scale. When the P-51s arrive, they arrive as a weather system, blanketing the sky in aluminum. They alter the behavior of the entire German military infrastructure. Trains stop moving, convoys pull off the road and camouflage themselves with frantic haste. The fear of the Mustang is the fear of being seen by an eye that never blinks. It creates a paralysis of movement, freezing the Wehrmacht in place during the daylight hours. A German tank commander moving to the front in late 1944 writes that the Jabos, the fighter bombers, have made the sun itself an enemy agent. To move under the American sky is to invite immediate, high-velocity strafing. But in the tactical zones near the front lines, where the British 2nd Tactical Air Force operates, the fear is acoustic and sudden. The Spitfire does not announce itself with a distant drone. It uses the terrain. It hugs the contours of the valleys, popping up over the hedgerows with a sudden tearing roar of its Griffin or Merlin engine. For the German infantryman, the Spitfire is a phantom. It appears, delivers a devastating burst of cannon fire, and vanishes back behind the tree line before a flak gun can even traverse. The fear here is not of paralysis, but of sudden violence. The Americans suppress you with weight. The British ambush you with precision. The Luftwaffe pilots attempting to support these ground troops find themselves engaged in a chaotic, low-level guerrilla war where their heavier fighters are clumsy and exposed, while the Spitfires move with the fluid grace of local predators who know every fold of the land. Even the introduction of the wonder weapons, the jet-powered Me-262s, does not solve the riddle of this two-pronged Allied dominance. The German jets are faster than anything in the sky, capable of leaving both the Mustang and the Spitfire behind in a straight line. But the Allies adapt with terrifying speed. The Mustang pilots, realizing they cannot catch the jets at top speed, begin to employ rat-catching tactics. They loiter high above the German jet bases, Rhein, Achmer, Lechfeld, waiting for the 262s to take off or land. In these vulnerable moments, when the jets are slow and their engines sluggish, the Mustangs dive. They kill the jets when they are essentially gliders. The German jet pilots, the elite of the elite, find that their technological superiority is nullified by the sheer range and persistence of the P-51. They are killed not by speed, but by the fact that the Americans can sit over their runways for hours, waiting. Conversely, when an Me-262 gets tangled in a dogfight with a Spitfire, the outcome is often determined by simple physics. The jet is fast, but it turns like a battleship. The Spitfire turns like a swallow. German reports detail incidents where jet pilots, arrogant in their speed, attempt to turn with a Spitfire, only to find the British fighter cutting inside their radius and putting rounds into their engines. The fear of the Spitfire for the jet pilot is the fear of geometry. They know that if they slow down to fight, they die. They are forced to fly strict booming passes, effectively fleeing the battlefield after every firing run. The Spitfire denies them the ability to dominate the airspace. It forces them to act as hit-and-run raiders in their own sky. The final verdict from the enemy perspective is stark. In the interrogation camps after the war, Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland is asked to compare the two adversaries. His response reflects the distinct psychological wounds inflicted by each. He describes the Mustang as the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. It was the strategic breaker, the machine that destroyed the training program, the fuel supply, and the safe havens.
It turned the German fighter force from a cohesive military unit into a scattered collection of hunted fugitives. But when speaking of the Spitfire, the tone shifts to professional reverence. The Spitfire was the weapon that broke the pilot's nerve. It was the superior combatant, the machine that you could not beat in a fair fight. Ultimately, the German pilot was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. If he climbed high to escape the Spitfires, he entered the freezing domain of the Mustang swarms, where he would be outnumbered 10-1 and chased to exhaustion. If he dove low to escape the Mustangs, he entered the turbulent, claustrophobic arena of the Spitfires, where he would be outturned and shredded by cannon fire. There was no safe altitude. There was no sanctuary. The Americans owned the distance, and the British owned the angles. As the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force in the spring of 1945, the silence that fell over the German airfields was the result of a perfect, suffocating synergy. The long arm of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the sharp knife of the Royal Air Force had left them nowhere to fly.
The strategic consequences of this dual dominance were catastrophic for the Third Reich. By early 1944, the combination of the Mustang's range and the Spitfire's tactical superiority had forced the Luftwaffe into a reactive, defensive posture that bled it white. The most significant turning point came during Big Week, Operation Argument, in February 1944. The Allies launched a massive coordinated assault on the German aircraft industry, but the factories were merely the bait. The true objective was to draw the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition. The P-51 Mustangs, now unleashed from the bomber formations, did not just protect their charges, they swept the skies ahead of them. In 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost over a third of its single-engine fighter strength. They lost the pilots they could not replace to save the factories they could not rebuild. The impact of this air superiority rippled down to the tactical level, fundamentally altering how the German army fought the war. In preparation for the invasion of Normandy, the Allies used their air power to isolate the battlefield. Here, the roles were clearly delineated. The Mustangs roamed deep into France and Germany, destroying the rolling stock, the locomotives, and the fuel trains that were essential for moving panzer divisions to the front. They created a zone of interdiction hundreds of miles deep. Meanwhile, the Spitfires of the 2nd Tactical Air Force began a systematic dismantling of the local infrastructure in northern France. They shot up radar stations, strafed staff cars, and hunted small convoys on back roads. This operational strangulation forced a humiliating change in German tactics. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who had mastered the art of mobile warfare in North Africa, found himself paralyzed in France. He could not move his panzer divisions by day. The Atlantic Wall was not just a fortification against the sea, it became a prison for the German army, pinned in place by an air force they could not see, but feared constantly. Rommel himself would fall victim to this new reality. On July 17, 1944, his staff car was strafed by a Spitfire of the RAF's 602 Squadron. The commander of Army Group B, the man charged with defending Europe, was removed from the war not by a tank or an assassin, but by a low-flying fighter that owned the airspace over a French country road. The Germans attempted to adapt, but their solutions only deepened their crisis. To combat the heavy American bombers, they developed the Sturmbach tactic. They took their Focke-Wulf 190s and bolted on heavy steel plating around the cockpit and engine, equipping them with 30mm cannons. These machines were formidable bomber killers, capable of shrugging off the defensive fire of a B-17. But the added weight made them sluggish and clumsy in a dogfight.
To protect these flying tanks, the Luftwaffe had to assign nimble Bf-109s to fly top cover and engage the American escorts. It was a complex, fragile system that required perfect coordination, and it fell apart the moment it met the Mustang. The Mustang simply ignored the heavy Sturmbach initially, climbed high to engage the Bf-109 top cover, and slaughtered them with superior energy tactics. Once the protective screen was gone, the Mustangs would dive on the heavy, slow Focke-Wulfs and tear them to pieces. The Germans had specialized their force to kill bombers, but in doing so, they had made themselves vulnerable to the fighters that now ruled the sky. They had built a hammer to smash glass, only to find themselves fighting a duel against a rapier. This failure of adaptation led to a collapse in fighter quality that accelerated the end of the war. Because the P-51s and Spitfires were everywhere, over the factories, over the training fields, over the front lines, the Luftwaffe could not safely train new pilots. Trainees were shot down on their first operational flights, sometimes even during transition training. The Jagdwaffe began to cannibalize its own future. They threw teenagers into the cockpits of high-performance fighters with barely a fraction of the flight time of their Allied counterparts. These novices were then sent up to face the Mustang terror at high altitude or the Spitfire wall at low altitude. The result was a massacre. The average life expectancy of a new German pilot in 1944 was measured in weeks, sometimes days. The Allies didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, they effectively prevented it from regenerating.
The final tragic act of this aerial drama played out on New Year's Day, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte was the Luftwaffe's last desperate gamble, a massive, coordinated low-level strike against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. It was an operation designed to exploit the tactical weakness of the Allied air forces, their reliance on forward airfields. But it became the graveyard of the German fighter force. While they managed to destroy hundreds of Allied aircraft on the ground, the cost was the annihilation of their remaining leadership. In the chaotic low-level furballs that erupted over the airfields, the German pilots ran into the waiting Spitfires and Tempests of the Royal Air Force, which were scrambling to meet them. The result was a slaughter of the Commodores. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 pilots that day, including many of their irreplaceable unit commanders. They had traded their last experienced leaders for parked airplanes that the Allied factories would replace in a week. It was a strategic suicide that highlighted the ultimate failure of the German doctrine. They could not fight the Spitfire on the deck, and they could not escape the Mustang in the transit. The operation broke the back of the Luftwaffe so thoroughly that for the remainder of the war, the Allies flew with near total impunity. The big friends, the bombers, no longer feared the German fighters. They feared only flak and mid-air collisions. As the Allied armies crossed the Rhine, the operational reality of the P-51 and Spitfire dominance led to a strange and terrifying phenomenon, the strafe-happy pilot. With no aerial opposition left, the Mustangs and Spitfires turned their guns entirely on the ground. The P-51, with its massive fuel load, became a roaming destroyer of German infrastructure. Pilots would fly rhubarbs, freelance combat missions, where they would shoot at anything that moved, barges, horse carts, individual soldiers on bicycles. The psychological terror this inflicted on the German population was profound. The Mustang made the war personal for every German citizen, bringing the violence of the front line to the quietest Bavarian village. There was no rear area anymore. There was only the sky and the silver machines that owned it. Meanwhile, the Spitfire's legacy was cemented in the tactical support of the final offensive. As the British Army advanced into northern Germany, they did so under a permanent umbrella of elliptical wings.
The Spitfire pilots perfected the art of cab rank tactics, orbiting over the battlefield like taxis waiting for a fare, diving within minutes to destroy a stubborn pillbox or a hidden 88mm gun at the request of a forward air controller. This close integration of air and ground power was the direct ancestor of modern close air support. The Spitfire had evolved from a desperate defender of island skies to the relentless spearhead of an invading army. The intelligence reports gathered after VE Day paint a picture of a German command structure that was intellectually defeated long before the surrender. General Adolf Galland, in his final reports, noted that the Allied air forces had achieved something the Luftwaffe never could: a perfect division of labor. The Americans provided the heavy hammer of strategic superiority, crushing the roof of the fortress. The British provided the sharp chisel of tactical superiority, picking the locks of the doors. Against one, the Germans might have found a counter-strategy. Against both, operating in concert, there was no solution. The German jet program, the Me-262, often cited as a lost opportunity, was rendered irrelevant by this synergy. The jets could run from the Spitfires, but they could not hide from the Mustangs that circled their airfields like vultures. By May 1945, the silence that fell over the German airfields was absolute. The wreckage of the Luftwaffe lay scattered across the continent: shattered Focke-Wulfs in the forests of the Ardennes, burned-out Messerschmitts on the runways of Berlin. They had been defeated by a two-headed monster. One head was an American airframe with a British engine that conquered the distance. The other was a British thoroughbred that conquered the turn. The war ended with a definitive lesson etched in the aluminum bones of the destroyed German aircraft. In the air, you cannot survive if you cannot run, and you cannot survive if you cannot fight. The Allies had built the machines that ensured the Luftwaffe could do neither.
Today, at air shows around the world, the P-51 Mustang and the Supermarine Spitfire often fly in formation. To the casual observer, they are simply beautiful machines, relics of a bygone era of piston engines and propellers. But to the ghosts of the Luftwaffe, they represent the two distinct halves of a closing trap. The Spitfire was the shield that saved a nation. The Mustang was the sword that liberated a continent. The story of these two fighters is, at its core, the story of the alliance itself. The Americans brought the audacity of distance, the belief that no target was too far, that the ocean itself was just a logistical hurdle. They built a plane that could conquer geography. The British brought the desperation of the cornered fighter, the belief that survival depended on being sharper, faster, and more agile than the giant standing at the gate. They built a plane that could conquer physics. But the supreme irony and the ultimate lesson of the air war lies under the cowling of the P-51. The Mustang only became a legend when it was mated with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The American body was given a British heart. This mechanical marriage is the perfect metaphor for the victory in the West. It was not American industrial might alone, nor was it British tactical genius alone. It was the fusion of the two, the mating of Detroit's assembly lines with Derby's engineering, that created a force the Third Reich could not withstand. The German pilots feared the Mustang because it meant they could not hide. They feared the Spitfire because it meant they could not fight. In the end, they were defeated not just by superior numbers, but by a superior philosophy, the realization that to win a global war, you need both the reach of the eagle and the bite of the lion. As the engines silence and the propellers slow to a halt, we are left with this enduring truth: perfection in war is rare, but when the hammer meets the anvil, the result is victory.